Hi, my name is Michelle Caplan. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Western Ontario, and today I'm presenting our paper entitled Does Party Discipline Suppress Substantive Representation? Co-authored by myself, Dr. Christopher Alcantara, and Dr. Mathieu Turgeon from the University of Western Ontario. In this presentation, I will present our research question, a brief review of the literature, our hypotheses, our case, our methods, our results, and some brief concluding remarks. One of the core challenges for democratic systems is representation. Often countries hope to elect legislative assemblies which descriptively represent their societies. However, few are able to fulfill this goal. As well as descriptive representation, some democratic countries hope to provide substantive representation beyond the country's dominant demographic groups. Even fewer countries have been successful in achieving this. This is particularly an issue for women who have struggled to achieve a level of political representation that is fair and just, even in countries like the United States, Australia, Britain, and Canada. While descriptive representation is achieved through the election of members belonging to these descriptive groups, substantive representation is achieved through an elected representative's ability to voice relevant concerns in the legislature. One of the possible explanations for the inability of women to obtain substantive representation in legislative assemblies is the presence of party discipline. Our research question is thus, to what extent does party discipline impact substantive representation relating to women's issues? Much of the literature relies heavily on two concepts for analyzing the role of women in legislative assemblies, descriptive and substantive representation. As mentioned earlier, descriptive representation, also referred to as mirror or numeric representation, refers to a politician's demographic characteristics such as their sex, their gender, their ethnicity, or their occupation, and the extent to which these characteristics are within the society they represent. The argument for descriptive representation is that politicians who represent various demographic groups within a society can transform into powerful symbols for these groups, which can encourage these groups to more strongly identify with the political system and become more interested and involved in the political process. Substantive representation, however, relates more to the behavior of a representative than just their demographic characteristics. Pitkin argues that overemphasizing descriptive forms of representation can distract from more salient concerns about how that representative behaves once elected. A legislature can be diverse, but if representatives are not representing the concerns of those belonging to their group, how effective is descriptive representation? Pitkin emphasizes instead the actions and words of political representatives and whether or not they are speaking or acting in the interest of the groups they represent and in a manner responsive to them. For women's issues, substantive representation means that female politicians are pursuing and championing the perspectives and interests of women. Substantive representation can, theoretically, allow for the possibility that any person can represent a descriptive group. Both male and female legislators can represent female constituents within the legislature, depending on what they say and what they do. Scholars in the field of identity politics, however, have emphasized the connection between descriptive and substantive representation, especially as this relates to women. Women, owing to their unique biological characteristics and socialization, are likely to have different life experiences and perspectives than men. Men are unlikely then to relate to the concerns women have and are less likely to be able to fully and capably understand and represent the needs and perspectives of women. Given this, proponents of democratic representation argue that more women need to be elected to political office to ensure that the preferences and values of women are adequately addressed and expressed in public policies, laws, and regulations. However, research has found that even in elected legislatures that closely mirror the proportion of men and women in a society, institutional and non-institutional barriers can suppress female substantive representation. In places where party discipline is weak, however, representatives are free to act as delegates, directly communicating the desires of their constituents, or they can take on the role of trustee, making decisions on behalf of their constituents using their own judgments and beliefs, or find a balance between the two. Where party discipline is strong, elected representatives are thought to represent and express the interests and opinions of their parties, which are often decided by a small group of leaders and elites. Opportunities to wield power and advance their careers in the form of cabinet positions and committee appointments often depends on the willingness of these elected politicians to follow the rules and decisions of their party and leadership. While some politicians are willing to defy their parties and pursue their own priorities, this is rare. Politicians often opt instead to raise issues within their party caucus meetings or in private with their party leaders. As a result of this, substantive representation under strong party discipline is thought to be muted and limited to the priorities of party leaders. As noted, the literature suggests a connection between the presence of female politicians and the raising of women's issues. So our first hypothesis is that female senators are more likely than male senators to raise women's issues in the Senate. The literature also suggests political parties treat women's issues differently and prioritize them differently. Studies have shown that in Canada, the Bloc Québécois, the NDP, and the Liberal Party of Canada have tended to be more liberal and more feminist as compared to progressive conservatives and Reform Party members, who are determined to be less feminist. Due to this, our second hypothesis is that Liberal senators are more likely to raise women's issues compared to conservative senators. Lastly, a growing body of literature has found that while strong party discipline can shape the substantive representation of women in a number of ways, it can also mute it completely. In some countries, political parties are seen as obstacles to advancing women's issues in the political system, especially when party discipline is often used to ensure representatives are representing the interests of the party over perhaps the interests of their constituents. One could expect that less party discipline would allow representatives to raise issues that are more pressing to either themselves or the groups they represent. Being that the Liberal Party is already expected to be more feminist in nature than the Conservative Party, and therefore often choose representatives that are more feminist than those chosen to represent the Conservative Party, our third hypothesis is that Liberal senators will be more likely to raise women's issues after party discipline is removed. In order to answer these questions, we decided to look at the Canadian Senate. Literature has studied the impact of women in the House, as well as in other countries where women are serving as elected representatives. As stated earlier, the literature has found a connection between the election of women and the substantive representation of women. However, there is a gap in the literature when it comes to the upper house and individuals holding non-elected positions. The Senate in Canada represents an interesting opportunity to study this question, particularly because on January 28, 2014, Justin Trudeau shocked Liberal senators with an announcement formally expelling them from the Liberal caucus, thus creating an environment where party discipline was lifted on some members, but not others. In order to study whether the lifting of party discipline made an impact on the substantive representation of women within the Senate, we looked at Senate Hansards from 2008 to 2019, giving us a relatively equal amount of time before the change and after the change. Senators before January 28, 2014 mostly belonged to the Conservative Party of Canada or the Liberal Party of Canada with a few independents. After January 28, 2014, the senators that were formerly part of the Liberal caucus formed what they called the Liberal Senators Group. From there, multiple other independent senator groups have formed, including the Independent Senators Group, which currently holds the largest plurality of members. The situation in the Senate has provided a very unique opportunity to look at the differences in behavior of members who were present both before and after the change, as well as allow us to compare a constant. Conservatives never lost their party discipline, whereas Liberal senators had their party discipline removed entirely. Our data set consists of 830 Senate Hansards that occurred over 3 parliaments from 2008 to 2019. Each statement, hereafter referred to as an intervention, was coded by senator, political party as of January 28, 2019, sex, year of birth, and date of appointment. In order to answer our research question and test our hypotheses, we employed 2 methods: dictionary analysis and difference in differences estimation. Dictionary analysis allows researchers to look beyond the words and see the patterns underlying them. This allows us to do content analysis in more objective ways and to produce measures that provide confidence in what we've discovered. Dictionary methods use lists of keywords in order to identify policy positions, tone, or other trends that can be detected in text. With dictionaries created from words and phrases that clearly identify a specific policy position, automated content analysis can produce highly valid results when measured against both hand-coded data and other data. Dictionaries can be especially adept at analyzing legislative data, as policy areas are easy to identify using specific keywords. To that end, we felt dictionary analysis was an appropriate way to identify the Senate interventions which pertain to women's issues. The dictionary we used was built using keywords associated with key issue areas, which are identified in the literature as women's areas of interest and concern. These issue areas include abortion, healthcare, family, education, social welfare, women's crime issues, and women's health issues. A list of keywords for each area was then developed. Using these keywords, computer analysis was run where interventions were coded as women's issues if they contained the keywords. Then this information was added to the data set. Next, we employed difference in differences estimation. Difference in differences estimation is used to measure the effect of sudden changes of policy, economic environment, or other treatment on a group of people. Treatments are exogenous sources of change. In the estimation, treatment groups are the people who experience the change, and the control group are people who do not. Difference in differences estimations estimate the treatment effects using between-group cross-sectional differences and within-group time series, meaning that they use variables that identify the treatment group versus the control group, as well as before the treatment and after the treatment. In order to analyze the difference in differences results, a few assumptions need to be made. Firstly, we have to assume that the treatment group outcomes and control group outcomes follow the same trend. We also have to assume that the treatment will cause differences from this trend and that these differences can be captured by fixed effects variables. For our study, the treatment is the exogenous change that occurred on January 28, 2014, when Justin Trudeau expelled the Liberal senators from the Liberal caucus. Therefore, our treated group are the senators who were Liberal as of January 28, and our control group are senators who were Conservatives as of January 28. Our main variable of interest is mentions of women's issues calculated by month. Using these measurements, we were able to test our hypotheses to look at the impact of raising women's issues and the impact the change had on both men and women, as well as Liberals versus Conservatives. So here are our results. On this first slide, we have a slide that represents all of the male senator interventions versus a slide that represents all of the women's senators' interventions. The red line indicates the trend before the change, and the blue line indicates the trends after the change. The x-axis is a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 is conservative and 1 is liberal. The y-axis is proportion of monthly mentions of women's issues. As we can see by these graphs, before the change, male conservative senators raise slightly more women's issues in the Senate than liberal senators, and they raise significantly more issues in the Senate than liberal male senators. They also raise significantly more women's issues in the Senate than the conservative female senators raise in the Senate. Looking at just women, what we can see here is that liberal female senators were more likely than female conservative senators before the change to raise women's issues. After the change, we still see that same trend. We see female liberal senators more likely than conservative female senators to raise women's issues, but that gap lessens significantly, and conservative women are raising more women's issues after the change than they were before, but liberal women senators are also raising more women's issues than they did before the change. This slide shows the results for just male senators. Here we can see, once again, that the conservative male senators before the change are doing the heavy lifting for their party, and they are the ones who are raising women's issues in the Senate. Liberal male senators are barely raising women's issues here. You can see the difference is substantial. After the change, we can see that the relationship reverses itself, where male conservative senators are now raising significantly less issues in the Senate for women than male liberal senators are. So looking at the entire data set together and looking at it divided by party and not looking at women versus men, we can see that before the change, liberals as a whole were mentioning more women's issues than conservative senators. And we know that this is largely being driven by female liberal senators before the change. As mentioned, male liberal senators are not raising that many women's issues. After the change, we can see this gap grow significantly. The liberal senators are raising significantly more women's issues in the Senate than their conservative colleagues are. What does this mean? Our first hypothesis was that female senators are more likely than male senators to raise women's issues in the Senate. What we found, however, was that under party discipline, female senators were raising less women's issues than male senators. And when drilling down by party, the result appears to be driven by a gap between female and male conservative senators specifically. Female conservative senators raise less women's issues than female liberal senators, but also significantly less women's issues than male conservative senators. After the change, however, both female liberal and conservative senators raise more women's issues than their male colleagues. Our hypothesis is half supported. Our second hypothesis was that liberal senators are more likely to raise women's issues compared to conservative senators. We found support for this hypothesis both before and after the change. Liberal senators raised more women's issues than male conservative senators before liberal senators were expelled from their caucus. When you divide this by gender, female liberal senators raised more women's issues than male liberal senators both before and after the change. Before the change, male liberal senators raised less women's issues than their conservative counterparts. However, after the change, they raised more women's issues than male conservative senators and slightly less women's issues than female conservative senators. This hypothesis finds support in the whole. But when looking at conservative versus liberal male senators, the hypothesis is not supported before the lifting of party discipline, but is supported after the change occurs. Lastly, our third hypothesis was that liberal senators will be more likely to raise women's issues after party discipline is removed. Our data shows us that liberal senators as a group raised more women's issues than conservative senators after the change, and that they raised more women's issues after the change than they did before. This is specifically the case for male liberal senators who raised women's issues more often after the change than they did before the change. But we do see an increase in mentions for both male and female liberal senators, so this hypothesis is supported. We think that this study has filled a necessary gap and has successfully answered whether party discipline is a deterrent to raising women's issues. After party discipline is lifted for the liberals, we see that male liberal senators particularly raise more women's issues, but that both male and female liberal senators raise more women's issues. What is interesting is that we see changes for male and female conservatives as well. The lifting of party discipline for the liberal senators has also resulted in female conservative senators raising more substantive women's issues. However, this had the opposite effect for conservative male senators who are now mentioning women's issues way less. In conclusion, we can see from the study that the removal of party discipline resulted in more women's issues being raised in the Senate. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. Here is my email address. Please feel free to ask me some questions in the Q&A, but also if you don't get an opportunity to, please feel free to email me directly and ask your questions. I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.